My kind and gentle father-in-law passed away after a long illness. His funeral, attended not only by family members but also by many of his business associates due to his wide circle of acquaintances, turned out to be a grand affair. I too wish to be sent off by my family and many friends like this at my end. I'll pick out some background music, so I'm counting on you. My husband told me without changing his usual attitude, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. To me, it was outrageous coming from him. Ask your real family for that. We're just a family for show, after all. There's no obligation to go that far, right? I declared, claiming to know all his secrets and confronting him with just a bit of evidence. His face turned pale and he freaked out. All of Dad's stuff is going to be inherited by me, his son. These words, blurted out in panic, only led my husband to face further hell. I moved in with my in-laws immediately after getting married. Although I was hesitant when the idea of living with my in-laws was first proposed before marriage, it would be a lie to say I didn't consider it. However, my in-laws were very kind people, and my husband assured me he would always be on my side, no matter what. Encouraged by the kindness of my in-laws and my husband's strong words, I decided to move in. After getting married, I continued working for a while but decided to quit my job just before turning 30 and became a full-time housewife. Partly because I wanted children and partly because my father-in-law's health was gradually declining. He kept working, saying it was too early for him to retire, but he started spending more time at home, going out less on his days off. My mother-in-law suggested he go to the hospital, but he never went, dismissing it as just a decline in physical strength that comes with age. Soon, my pregnancy became evident. My father-in-law, looking forward to the birth of his grandchild, seemed to gradually regain his spirits upon learning of my pregnancy. When my son was born, seeing him happily holding the baby made our family bond stronger, and we deeply felt our happiness. About a year after my son's birth, my husband was transferred to a different department at work. His job content seemed to change, leading to increased overtime. He came home late, catching the last train for half the week, and by the latter half of the month, his overtime hours exceeded the limit, leaving him unpaid for extra work. I doubted the sense in working overtime under such conditions. If it was a company mandate, it seemed clearly exploitative, and I thought it might be better to take action. Meanwhile, my husband started staying out more, citing business trips. Despite being a weekday, he often came home late from drinking parties. Gradually, he started making more excuses to go out alone on weekends and holidays as well. I had tolerated his absence from home on workdays without complaint. Understanding from my own work experience that unpaid overtime was sometimes necessary to finish work. I understood that such things inevitably happen when you're working. However, I couldn't understand why he would be so busy as to give up his holidays as well. Recently, having seen news stories about overwork deaths, I couldn't help worrying about his health. My husband, perhaps annoyed by my interference, began to be vague about his reasons for going out. Hey, who exactly calls a family man out on his day off? Someone from work? They know you have a young child, right? We had received birth gifts from his colleagues and his direct boss. So I found it hard to believe that they would overwork him. There was a time when such practices were tolerated, but nowadays, companies that encourage leaving on time and discourage working on holidays are becoming more common. I wanted to speak out against any company or boss that would deliberately do the opposite. Don't meddle in a man's work. I don't want to meddle in your work. But is it too much to ask for you to act a bit more like a father? I'm earning money as a father, aren't I? What more do you want? And so, our conversations always ended in arguments. My mother-in-law also warned that if things continued this way, my husband would become a stranger rather than a father to our child, but her attempts to stop his outings were utterly ineffective. First of all, the reason I can never relax is because you're completely failing as a wife. It started with him saying I should stay up and wait for him to come home because I'm his wife, questioning why I would ever eat before him, and stating it's obvious that he should be the first to take a bath. Essentially, my husband began to dictate how a wife should behave. Once our child grows a bit, I might be able to adjust my meals and wake-up times to match my husband's. But right now, with a young child, it's inevitable that our life centers around the child more than my husband. My mother-in-law strongly opposed him on this matter. Basically, you lack feminine charm. Before being a mother, you're my wife and a woman, right? Women like you must be what they mean when they say a woman gives up being a woman once she gets married. I'm just unlucky to have married such a woman. How can I be expected to keep up appearances and take care of the house and child? If you want me to stay beautiful, help out with the child rearing. If I had time to put on makeup, I'd rather lay down for a bit, and even if I want to refresh my wardrobe, shopping with a child is anything but relaxing. Without my husband's help in taking care of our child, maintaining the image of the beautiful wife he demands is impossible. Just saying whatever he wants. His uncooperative attitude made me suspect him of cheating. There were several signs that led me to suspect infidelity. I might be accused of taking dramas and stories from cheated-on wives too seriously, but the frequent business trips, weekend work, and calls to come in on holidays were telling. The scarce time he spent at home, the many outings under the guise of work, mentioning his boss or colleagues to justify his departures. There was no trace of women's cosmetics or perfume on him, nor excessive credit card use, but his attitude of "don't complain, I'm giving you living expenses," was suspicious. It's as if he was told that as long as he provides financially, nothing else should matter. Around that time, my father-in-law's previously diagnosed illness worsened. With my mother-in-law's persuasion, he finally underwent tests at the hospital, but his disease was chronic and would require ongoing management. My father-in-law, already retired, was living a life of medication and compromise, with my husband's income supporting our household. Perhaps this financial pressure was why my husband's attitude became more domineering and harsh. Even with two women, there's a limit to how much we can support my father-in-law. He decided to be hospitalized to avoid a sudden turn for the worse, considering the burden on me and my mother-in-law. Going to visit him in the hospital was challenging. There was no suitable hospital nearby, and it took about 30 minutes by car to reach a large hospital equipped to deal with his condition. Neither my mother-in-law nor I drive, so we had to rely on taxis or public transport. How much easier it would have been if my husband could just drive us. Visiting? Carrying stuff? It's not necessary. It's just my dad making a big deal out of a checkup and hospital stay. My husband dismissed the idea of visiting the hospital and never once went. Even when I said it would help if he just drove us close by, he insisted that my mother-in-law and I were exaggerating and let time pass without offering any assistance. As my father-in-law's condition deteriorated, despite our desperate care, he passed away. A few days before his death, my husband said he had a long business trip. This was when the doctor had told us he had only a couple of days left. What kind of company forces work at a time like this? I rarely raised my voice, but I couldn't help but lash out at my husband. But he just retorted, "Who do you think you're living off?" and left. My mother-in-law had hurt her back caring for my father-in-law, so we stayed at a nearby hotel to tend to him. There was no time to merely grieve, we were busy arranging the funeral and everything that came with it. My father-in-law was a highly respected man, and despite being retired, many of his former colleagues and subordinates attended his funeral. Many volunteered to help, providing great relief to my mother-in-law and me. No family member spoke ill of him, they tearfully shared memories of my father-in-law. His funeral was a warm and gentle farewell. However, my husband, who acted as the chief mourner, ruined the funeral's peaceful atmosphere with his behavior at the meal afterward. "Hey, we need more booze here. And we're running low on meatloaf at this table. You're the wife, you should be more attentive." We had entrusted the funeral arrangements to the funeral home, anticipating a large turnout. The staff could have easily handled requests for additional drinks or food. Yet, instead of speaking directly to them, he first demanded of me. Moreover, during my father-in-law's battle with illness, my husband embarrassed me in front of distant relatives who couldn't visit and his company colleagues by saying things like, "Sorry for my useless wife. She's just like that at home too, and she leaves all the caregiving to my mother and the hospital while she just lazes around at home, the worst kind of wife. But that's exactly what he was doing. I was furious but realized arguing would just put me on the same level as him. So, I swallowed my irritation and said, "Please let me know if there's anything I can do," despite my shortcomings, trying to maintain his dignity. But when my mother-in-law suggested it might be time to wrap up, nearly everyone had stayed till the end, mourning my father-in-law. Seeing this, my husband muttered something about wanting to be sent off by family in the same way. He might not have been aware he spoke aloud, but I heard him clearly and thought, "How dare you say that? Since I can't fulfill that wish, why don't you ask your other family?" When he looked puzzled, I mentioned his wish to have a funeral attended by family like his father's. Realizing his thoughts had slipped out, he started making excuses in a panic. "I'm a good husband, right? We're not struggling financially, and our future's secure, right? What's wrong with talking about my ideal funeral?" However, the remaining relatives were puzzled by the mention of another family, looking back and forth between us. It was only then my husband realized the gravity of the situation. Sweating and eyes darting around. "Another family? No idea what you're talking about. Maybe my dad had a secret child or something?" Despite his attempts to feign innocence, I pulled out a document entrusted to me by my father-in-law and shoved it in front of my husband, turning his face pale. It was as if I was watching the blood drain from his face. Turns out, I wasn't the only one suspecting my husband of cheating. I only harbored suspicions, but never actually took any action. More accurately, I wanted to act but couldn't. As a stay-at-home mom, I had limited funds and couldn't just go to a detective agency or follow him around with our son in tow. But my father-in-law had used his savings to hire a detective to investigate my husband's behavior. Even before I had noticed anything, my father-in-law wanted to hand over the evidence of my husband's infidelity to me, while he still had the consciousness and had called me over to do so. Shortly after giving me the documents, he passed away. He had introduced me to a lawyer friend in case I needed help. I had already consulted with my mother-in-law the day I received the documents. We decided to confront my husband after all funeral-related matters were settled, thinking it inappropriate to involve the relatives in our personal issues until then. But with my husband continuing his self-centered behavior, disregarding our feelings, I decided not to hold back any longer. "Thinking you could get away with just an affair was a big mistake," I said, scattering not just the paper with evidence of his infidelity but also photos of them being affectionate, entering love hotels, on vacations together. "There's a child involved with your mistress, right? When's the due date?" It aligns with when my father-in-law decided to be hospitalized. "While my mother-in-law and I were caring for him, you were getting your mistress pregnant." My mother-in-law was furious. I was worried her blood pressure would skyrocket. Some relatives tried to calm her, while others condemned my husband as a disgrace to the family. With no one on his side, my husband kept making feeble excuses to get through the situation. "I was just hanging out with a girl from the bar, that's all." Even though his excuses for the trips and hotels might somehow make sense, they were desperately weak. Among the relatives, some who own bars pointed out that getting someone pregnant is way beyond normal socializing if you're not working there. Even if it was just hanging out at a bar, a man with a wife and child should decline intimate after-hours or companionship out of respect for his wife. My husband might have thought that mentioning his connections to bar owners would win him some sympathy from the male relatives. However, not a single male relative showed any sympathy for him. Instead, they looked at him with disgust and criticized him. Then my husband became defiant. He had planned to keep his affair hidden until he received his estate from my father-in-law, but since it was out in the open, he saw no need to hide it anymore. He stated that once the inheritance was settled, he would divorce me, marry his mistress, and start a new life with a new family. "All this is your fault, you're such a failure of a wife. Dad favored you because you must have flirted with him behind our backs, right? Compared to Mom, even someone like you would seem better." Hearing this, my mother-in-law cried out, "What a disgrace you are," and then broke down crying. My father-in-law had been kind and attentive to me because I had lost my own father early on. I had confided to him that I didn't know what it was like to have a father. That conversation happened in the presence of my mother-in-law, who said it was okay to think of my father-in-law as my real father. So, I admired and was sometimes spoiled by my father-in-law as if he were my real father. My in-laws had always wanted a daughter, so they treated me not just as a daughter-in-law but as their own daughter. That's all there was to it. To equate the affection of my in-laws with something romantic was outrageous. My husband's rotten brain, which linked every interaction with the opposite sex to romance, made me nauseous. Into this chaotic scene stepped a man. The lawyer my father-in-law had introduced to me. The lawyer told my husband, "You're not getting any inheritance, you know?" If my husband hadn't brought up the inheritance, the lawyer might have just watched to see how things unfolded. But since my husband mentioned divorcing after getting his inheritance, the lawyer thought it best to clarify the facts sooner. My father-in-law had rewritten his will in his hospital room, not long before he passed away, wanting to ensure my mother-in-law and I could inherit without leaving anything to my husband. My husband insisted he had a right to some portion of the inheritance as his son, confident at least in receiving the legal minimum share. My father-in-law had anticipated such a scenario and arranged his estate so that even if my husband made a claim for his statutory share, he would receive next to nothing. When I say next to nothing, after deducting legal fees and such, it might even be less than nothing, said the lawyer. I'm not sure how much lawyers charge, but knowing my father-in-law, he made sure the amount my husband could get would indeed be minimal. My husband, who worked for a decent company and believed he would be financially well off after inheriting, had been squandering money with his mistress ever since he found out about his father's illness and retired early. He was convinced the inheritance would more than cover his expenses. My husband worked for a pretty good company, so his salary was decent. However, the living expenses he bragged about providing were meager compared to his salary, and when I questioned this, he made excuses about salary cuts and missing bonuses, but it seems all that money was actually spent on his affair. My father-in-law was a high-ranking executive at a major company. I heard that when my father-in-law retired early and was rehired, thanks to his respected personality, he got rehired under very favorable conditions. I remember my husband bragging that he never struggled with money. Perhaps that's why he thought he would inherit millions, maybe even up to $2 million. My husband collapsed to the floor in shock. My mother-in-law, crying and furious, wondered aloud how her son turned out this way, blaming herself. I believe, while parents' influence is significant during childhood, it's up to the individual once they enter society. It seems my husband could be easily influenced by the people he associated with. My husband's attitude worsened after starting his affair, perhaps influenced by his mistress. Even if the mistress was the root cause, as an adult, my husband is responsible for his own actions. How did it come to this? He kept asking himself, shouting. The relatives and my mother-in-law looked at him coldly and threw him out. I'm the chief mourner. You can't do the cremation or burial without me. Show some respect. You don't need a chief mourner to carry out a cremation. After all, cremation is a legal obligation, and failing to do so would mean we'd be charged with abandoning a corpse. The placement of ashes doesn't require a chief mourner either. Just some useless idiot blabbering, we said dismissively, effectively erasing my husband's presence. Weeks later, when my husband unexpectedly returned to the family home, I confronted him with divorce papers. He claimed he was the one who should be initiating the divorce, but I informed him that since he was the one who cheated, if I dragged my feet, the divorce wouldn't go through easily. I considered dragging it out as a form of resistance or retaliation, but with a child involved, that wasn't the best option. For my son's sake, we needed to change our environment quickly. My husband was unhappy about losing control, but since he also wanted the divorce to happen soon, he reluctantly agreed to my terms. However, that didn't mean I wanted anything more to do with him. My mother-in-law and I told him to enjoy his new family and kicked him out of the family home. His belongings were already tossed in a corner of the yard. I told him we'd send the rest to his new address, fully ejecting him from our lives. Later, he showed up with his mistress, both looking defeated yet strangely triumphant. The mistress taunted me, suggesting I must be bitter for losing my husband, and claimed it was just deserts for neglecting my appearance. She then gloated that the estate would all be my husband's, leaving me penniless in the divorce. It seemed my husband hadn't told her about being left with nothing. She arrogantly claimed her unborn child would have a better life than my son, who would be living with a penniless mother. Just then, a message from my husband popped up on my phone. Calmly asking the mistress to wait, I checked the message. My husband was demanding child support for the unborn child, claiming it would be unfair for the siblings to live in different circumstances. While my in-laws might consider both children their grandchildren, could I really feel affection for a child conceived while my father-in-law was suffering? I ignored my husband's demand and revealed to the mistress details about her I hadn't mentioned to my husband yet, including her name, workplace, and family background. She freaked out, knowing her secrets. The mistress was furious, wondering how I knew so much about her background. When she raised her hand to me, I warned. Going to hit me? I'd sue for assault. Everything here is being recorded by surveillance cameras. Pointing to the camera in the corner, she reluctantly lowered her hand. My father-in-law had advised me to always keep evidence. So with the help of relatives, we had installed cameras after his funeral. I told my husband that the documents my father-in-law left clearly stated the mistress was his direct subordinate, and I would report their affair to his company. It didn't matter who seduced whom. They were both consenting adults in the affair. My husband begged me not to report him, clinging to my legs. Disgusted, I shook him off. Knowing they couldn't afford to have the evidence against them, they left without further resistance. Later, I sued my husband for alimony and child support and the mistress for compensation, through a lawyer introduced by my father-in-law. As I expected a response, the mistress called me in a fury, having gotten my number from my husband's phone. She wrongly assumed I'd forgive and back down if she kept quiet. She ranted about misunderstanding the situation and regretted not hitting me when she had the chance. I never said I'd forgive. I merely stated I'd sue for assault if she attacked me. The call went silent. I suspected they were up to no good, but surprisingly, the next words were an apology. The mistress started by saying she had been informed by the lawyer I hired that my mother-in-law and I were to receive my father-in-law's inheritance, and nothing was left for my husband. She apologized for her past behavior and asked if some of the estate could be shared with my husband, suggesting perhaps the claims for alimony and such could be waived as a result. I argued that an apology doesn't erase everything and that matters like these should not be settled lightly but with tangible resolutions. In other words, I rejected the mistress's request. I had no intention of agreeing to any sort of deal. My husband, who was listening in, began arguing with her about the plan going awry, leading to a major fight between them. They were both so out of touch with reality, perhaps they deserved each other. I wanted as little as possible to do with my husband's face or voice. I was ready to take this to court if necessary, but that would be more troublesome for him, especially since I heard his direct boss despises dishonesty. When I mentioned that this could become known to his boss, my husband quickly agreed to my terms for divorce, alimony, and child support, apparently seeing his boss as a significant threat. The mistress, however, brazenly challenged me to report them, so I did just that, as she wished. It turned out to be quite the blowback for my ex-husband, but it's his fault for not being able to control his affair partner. I later found out that my ex-husband's boss was a woman who had divorced due to her husband's affair with a younger subordinate, much like my situation. Upon hearing my report, she promised to impose the most severe penalty possible. Both ended up being relocated to different positions as a punishment. My ex-husband reluctantly accepted the reassignment, but his affair had become known even at his new location, leading to his eventual resignation. The mistress protested the reassignment to HR but to no avail, and, faced with raising a child, she quit, not wanting to work in such a place. With my ex-husband unemployed, he couldn't cover alimony and child support with his savings alone and ended up in debt. The only lenders willing to deal with an unemployed person were dubious at best, so he's now chased by repayments. We changed all the locks at the family home, making it impossible for my ex-husband to return even if he wanted to. Homeless, he moved into the mistress's apartment. But continued unemployment led to eviction threats due to unpaid rent. They ended up turning to the mistress's parents' home, but things didn't go as planned. While her parents scolded her, they still took her in, along with her newborn. Her parents said the child was innocent and allowed her to live at their home but refused to provide any support for childcare or her actions that led to the destruction of my family. However, my ex-husband, having dishonored their beloved daughter, incited the wrath of his mistress's parents and was driven out. Rejected by her parents as trash. My ex-husband couldn't return to the family home or seek help from relatives. His dreams of a happy life with a younger woman shattered by reality. The reality is being abandoned by both families, losing work, and having nowhere to belong. He's now living in a dingy, bathroom-less apartment, cutting corners to pay off the debt from the lawsuit and monthly child support. Struggling to find steady work, he's living day-to-day on odd jobs. Yet, the mistress hasn't abandoned him. Working hard herself for their young child. And the worthless man she's chosen. Despite being betrayed, I now feel grateful she took this loser off my hands. Thanks to my father-in-law, I was able to push this shallow man to his limits. As a parent, I understand the difficult decisions involved in protecting a child. Now, as a mother, I'm determined to do anything for my son. I'm not sure I could make the same tough choices as my father-in-law if faced with his situation. But I'm committed to raising my son properly. We're now living modestly in the family home my father-in-law left. Trying to grow and learn together as a new mother.